Well, thanks everybody for joining. I'm really excited to have Emilie Wagner giving us a little design thinking workshop focusing on consumers and end users. Emilie is an instructor at the Stanford D School, the Stanford Design School. She's a design thinking expert, in my opinion. She's focused on healthcare design strategy right now, but has also worked on several other areas, including technology, finance, energy, consumer goods, you name it. She's the design thinking wizard. So this workshop is going to focus on consumers, on interview best practices, and we're going to break out into pairs and do kind of one-on-one workshops after she gives us a little tutorial. And then after the one-on-one breakout sessions, we'll come back together, discuss findings and learnings, and wrap up after that.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. It doesn't look like I have screen sharing abilities. Thanks. Thanks. Well, it's great to be here. I just moved to Boston, so while I still work at Stanford, I'm local. Today is all about understanding your end user or your customer. And so I'll give you a little bit of an intro to design thinking, and then we're going to spend most of today like experimenting together and learning and practicing these different techniques, and also building some sense of community. As we're all distributed, it's really nice to get to know each other a little bit better. So design thinking, I want to first introduce you to Doug Dietz. Doug is an engineer at GE, and several years ago, he had just wrapped up a 2-year endeavor of designing a new state-of-the-art new MRI that was award-winning. And he had received numerous accolades and was feeling quite on top of the world. He wanted to see his machine, this is what he designed, in action. So he went to a hospital just to observe and kind of appreciate this product actually getting to market. And while he was there, the tech asked him to please step aside as there was a patient, a child coming in for an MRI. So Doug stepped out of the room and noticed a little girl walking down the hallway with her mom and dad on each side of her, and she was crying. She was in uncontrollable tears and was clearly very scared at this experience. And it was in that moment that Doug started to look around and see the world and his machine from the 7-year-old's perspective. As you can see, it's just lots of beige colors, yellow tape making it feel like a caution sign. And he saw mom and dad having to console or comfort their daughter in a moment that was actually quite emotional for them as well. And they said, "You can do this. We've talked about this. You can get through this." And he suddenly realized that his MRI machine was a pretty traumatic experience for many people. And it was a perspective he had never appreciated. When he asked the MRI tech how children and people go through this, they said there's about an 80% sedation rate to get children through these machines. So Doug felt like he had failed all of a sudden. So he decided like he should start to get to know kids better and truly design for the end user. And that's what he did. So he went to children's daycares. He went to children's museums. He met with families at their homes. He played alongside kids. And he really started to see the world through their playful, curious eyes. And it was this experience that helped him transform his machine into something called the Adventure series. It is the exact same machine, just covered in decals, the stickers that people hang up in their rooms or homes right now. So a very low cost solution that totally transformed the experience for the end user. It's now a narrative where the nurses serve as like pirates, Children have to go through this pirate adventure. When it gets extremely loud, they are told that that's thunder and they have to lie very still. There's aromatherapy. There are rock decals that they have to jump to and from to get there. And it's just really changed the entire dynamic of this. And the result is not only an increase in satisfaction of 92% among patients that they surveyed for this, but sedation rates decreased to like less than 1% because of this new experience. So the point of this story is really drawing a comparison between different approaches to problem solving and innovation. Doug's initial approach was really business and technology driven. So he and his team developed the technology and their true engineering mindset. They identified the business opportunity, and then they created the MRI machine and ultimately had to fit them to users. In human-centered design or design thinking or design-driven innovation, we're really spending time up front understanding our users, then creating concepts, and finally developing the technology and building the business. So while you are dedicating a little bit, and it's not even time, but just thought and care and an openness to getting to know your user up front, it's providing more clarity and focus later on. So human-centered design is at the intersection of these three: technology, business, and human values. And the human values one is very often ignored in business and product development, service development, and so forth. And this is really an exploration of usability and desirability. What started as an approach to product innovation is now spanning across brand, environment, services. You really can use human-centered design for anything, and it's therefore no wonder that it's really everywhere. You'll see it pop up, and it's here to stay. We need it now more than ever. If you compare the CEO of your local grocer in the 1950s, that not only ran the business, but they stocked the shelves, they checked out customers, they spoke with customers, they knew the needs of their customers. Whereas now we have many people making decisions from behind computers, from boardrooms, from across the world. And so we need to get creative with ways that we better understand the needs of our users. So design thinking can be very succinctly summarized as 4 steps: empathy research, understanding our user; synthesizing, so like redefining our problem based on the needs that we understand now; generating ideas to solve those like real needs, not the ones you thought they had; and then testing those ideas, prototyping them. And it's not always this linear. We really dial up the human-centered aspect throughout it. So now we'll double click just into empathize before we explore the tools that we're gonna learn today. So in empathy research, your goal is to understand someone who in many ways is unlike you. You want to see the world from their shoes. So just think of a kid. They're curious about everything. They ask why nonstop all day long. They don't judge. They question everything. They listen. They're optimistic. And our goal in this is to focus more on what people actually do and less on what people say they do, and less on what you think they do. You are not normal. You might know their problems, but you're not always a representative example of your end user. So this is an important distinction when you are understanding the needs of your user. Explicit needs are the needs that people can articulate really easily. It's kind of like the low-hanging fruit, so obvious. But in design thinking, we really push to understand the implicit needs, those that are less obvious, not possible to articulate, that we uncover through more deeply understand our users through conversations and through observation. So in design thinking, there's a boatload of different empathy methods that you can use. So there's observation, shadowing someone, asking them to walk you through their experience. Real time, there's one-on-one interviews, whether that's just 5 minutes, 30 minutes, or 2 hours. There's empathy probes, which is an activity that you can do with people side by side to get them visually communicating their thoughts. There's immersion, where you could use a VR headset to better empathize and feel like what it's like to be your end user. There's also self-documentation, which you can prompt people with like a diary study, or you can just tap into existing social media posts and stuff to really identify patterns and nuances. Throughout this, you're really trying to look for workarounds. What feels odd or surprising or contradictory, like the clip that holds a biker's pant leg, or someone tucking the tea bag into the lip of the cup, using tongs to reach something higher up, or in the bottom right, to understand if the projector's on, they had to put streamers over it to see if the fan was on. So these workarounds lead you to opportunity areas for solutioning. Finally, before we move on into the exercises, I often get the question is like, how does quantitative and qualitative research fit into design thinking? Often clients will come to me with quant research, which describes what is going on. And my job is to understand why. So we lean heavily into the qualitative research. So the quant is like patterns that are revealed. And then you often will interview or engage with some of the more extreme users, because almost like caricatures, the insights, the nuances are easier to understand or uncover to understand why it's going on. So that was a really quick introduction to human-centered design and being empathetic. In my own work, I spend time first observing what's going on. For example, if I'm working for a hospital client, recently I improved the pre-visit experience for a digestive health clinic. I spent time in the clinic watching people in the waiting room. I sat alongside the front desk staff, watching them do their jobs, but also asking them to asking them questions and to walk me through what they were doing. So today we're kind of exploring the observation aspect of getting to know your end user and the conversation aspect, the interviewing, which I said can be either 5 minutes or 2 hours. I'll pause for a question or two here. Anyone have a question before we move on? No. Can't see you all. All right, let's dive into observation. So I love this quote. It says, "The only real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." So I'm going to ask you to put on new eyes for this activity. Here's a picture of an event, something going on. And if you could just take yourselves off mute and just start yelling out, like, what do you see? What do you observe here? What are you noting? What are you seeing?
Doctors.
Doctors.
Unhappy patient.
Unhappy patients.
Looks like
really-
blood being drawn.
Blood being drawn, maybe.
People caring for each other.
People caring for each other. Yeah.
I was going to say collaboration. You have teams of medical professionals working together.
Yes. So we're talking about relationships, interactions here. We're inferring what people's different roles are. There's currently different roles, maybe some hierarchy, some emotion going on. Yeah, so this is a great start. We could continue to watch and observe and make more notes. But there's some ways that we can do this a little bit more intentionally. And the secret to observing is to watch, similar to what we just did, and first be overwhelmed with detail. Like there's a lot going on here, and sometimes it just makes you just glaze over a lot of it and see just a few aspects. The next goal is to get bored and to then get tired and frustrated, but push on and watch some more until you finally notice something new. It's not until you can kind of ignore or acknowledge the obvious that you start to question things or note the nuances. So a good framework for doing this is called AEIOU, observation. And in a notebook, I'll literally jot down AEIOU, and I'll use that to challenge myself to nonstop write what I'm seeing as an observationist. So What activities do I see going on? What are people doing? So that's the verbs. What's the environment like? How would I describe every aspect of this environment? What's the tent look like? What's the coloring? What is the smell? What are the sounds? Interactions. Who do we see interacting? What people do we see interacting? What objects do we see people interacting with? Objects. Write down every single thing you see because it might tip you off to something. And finally, users. What do you notice about the users? What are they discussing? What are they doing? What does the body language say? But also be careful of noting like things that are more fact-based and those that are more inference-based. So acknowledge your inferences, like I'm not sure what that person's role is, but it's some sort of caregiver role. So feel free just to note something new now. Oops, sorry. Using this no framework. Take yourselves off mute. What do you see?
I see a lot of temporary solutions and structures. So you have a temporary tent, temporary foldable tables and chairs, things like that are mobile, but maybe aren't as necessarily sound or robust in their function.
That's great. Yes. So we're getting a little bit more quirky in our descriptions now, which is great. What else? Objects. I see a stool. I see backpacks under tables. You get the point, but like it forces you to go much deeper so that you ultimately can get bored and notice something new rather than just glazing over. Give one more example of observation. So this is out of my friend Isabel's need finding class at the D School. So she tasked her students with just going to the grocery store and going to the meat section and observing something interesting, coming back with something that they've learned that's new. So the first round, her students came back and said, grocery stores tend to organize their meat counter according to the type of cut. Now, okay, yeah, that's an observation, but I feel like I could have told you that before you even went and did that observation. So push a little further and find something new. They came back again and said, when buying a steak, people tend to spend a little bit more time choosing a steak than they do when buying hamburger. So this feels like a little bit more interesting than the way that people organize their meat. But still, I feel like that seems fairly obvious. Like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I'm not saying, aha, or ooh. But it was when they came back with this, they felt like they were in a solution area or an exciting place. When buying a steak, many people pick up one steak and poke at it. Then they pick up another one and compare the two. Then they usually walk away with the first one. So now there's something here around behavior and habits and decision-making that if you fed this observation, no pun intended, to the head of that grocery store, they could start to do something with this, change an experience, offer something new in terms of service, connect with customers in a different way, and maybe even translate that to different departments. So push yourself to come up with something that makes people go, ah, cool, it makes them think. Let's see. Okay, so now we're on to the fun part, interviewing. And interviewing for me is often with 6 or 7 end users, and it's one-on-one, or I'll have a note taker, and I'll ask for at least an hour and a half of their time, sometimes 2 hours, and we compensate them $150, $200 for their time. Pre-COVID, I was doing it at people's homes or in a place of relevance to the topic we were discussing, which as a healthcare strategist was often in a hospital setting. Now during COVID, I'm conducting these on Zoom, and in a lot of ways it's working well because we're instantly in people's homes or places of work and they can show us around. And people I think the encouraging part is that I don't feel like my research has been compromised due to the distributed connections. So with an interview, there is certainly an art or a science to it that over the years I've kind of picked from different practitioners' toolkits to come up with an approach to how you might interview someone. So here are two people you are likely familiar with, Stephen Colbert and Terry Gross. Stephen Colbert is a comedian, often on politics. Terry Gross is a Fresh Air host on NPR. As an interviewer, who do we think we want to emulate? I'll do the punchline. And we want to emulate Terry Gross. So as you listen to future NPR shows or podcasts, clue in to the art of interviewing. I think the number one rule is to listen more than you talk. So unlike Stephen Colbert, who's charged with delivering the punchline and interjecting, a really good interviewer is comfortable with silence. They speak 10% of the time and listen 90% of the time. Terry keeps her questions succinct and simple. One sentence, maybe two. She embraces silence. Often that's when people do their best thinking and will fill the void with something more juicy or emotional or insightful. And while I can't let you feel it here, I'll say that with my students and everyone, the silence always feels much more profound for the interviewer than the interviewee. It never feels long enough for the interviewee, the silence. And Terry asks open-ended questions, not like these yes/no leading things. All right, so who else do we want to emulate? Barbara Walters or Maury Povich? Let's go for Barbara Walters in this one instance, in that she and other interviewer journalists are responsible for staying like natural in their demeanor and neutral, so not judging.
No Howard Stern.
I know that would be really pushing it, but maybe not. Maury Povich just might be worse. And yet they're respectful without shying away. So I think there's a story where she's interviewing Mike Tyson and his wife, and he reveals that there's domestic abuse that he's causing in their household. And it was just like a bombshell, like dropped in this interview. It was the first public reveal of it. And rather than like revealing her like, what? Like, and like kind of attacking him or judging him, all she did was lean in and say, can you tell me more? And then he opened up and shared more. So the person that you're interviewing has to feel heard and like in a safe environment and like they're the true expert in what they're talking about. And finally, do we want to mimic a Shakespearean play or with 5 acts or like Second City's improv? We're more like improv. So we want it to feel like a very natural, organic conversation, follow their lead, but there is some high level direction, just like an improv. There's some tricks, there's some rules, there's some guidelines. So overall, traditional arc can, and I'm gonna provide you guys with these slides. And so I have like cheat sheets for great questions that you can ask within each of these categories. So like an introduction, a way to build rapport, seeking stories, and throughout this, understanding emotion. So for me, I think like seeking stories and understanding emotion comes through the follow-up questions and then wrapping up. And so I'm not gonna outline, and throughout this, it's critical that you take notes, copious notes, and as much as you can write in direct quotes, because the goal is to be supporting or backing up your positioning in the voice of your end customer. So we'll have these, I'm not going to go through them, but these are specific ways to start an interview, best practices, like keeping it simple, talking about the time, and then like questions like how you might build rapport. Like, tell me a little bit about yourself. When I say like grocery shopping, what comes to mind? And seeking stories. So there's different categories of stories you can look for. So tell me about the best, tell me about the worst time, tell me about the last time. So you're asking about something specific without asking like a generalization, or like, what does your like average day look like? That doesn't get you as much as like the best or the worst. And I love ones that like ask you to have someone compare like changes, like how does your approach to grocery shopping differ from your friends, or how has your approach to grocery shopping evolved over time? That's a really a helpful question. And then exploring emotion. Ask follow-up questions. Like, tell me more about like the time that you threw, like you stole the meat at the meat counter. Or how did that make you feel? When, what do you mean when you say clueless? Or what do you mean when you say annoying? So anytime they use a word, I really like to clue in on that and ask them to define it. It pulls out a lot of insights. And then finally wrapping up. By this time you've built rapport, and I love asking folks like, what surprised you? What have you learned? Or is there anything else you want to share? So you guys can pour over these on your own and create your own guides, or just use them as frameworks for conversations you have in the future. But right now I'd love for you just to take your phones and to either take a screenshot of this or just like a photo of this, because you are going to be sent to breakout rooms now to practice interviewing each other. So this is a loose guide that you can use. Like, tell me a bit about yourself. And the topic we're going to be exploring is one that you can all relate over, and it's about your career paths and your career development to date. And so focus on career stories. And I'm going to challenge you in the like follow-up questions to the stories. The second one, what do you mean when you say, and then insert word? I'm going to challenge you to ask that at least once and see how that feels. And at the end, feel free to say like, what did you learn? What surprised you from this conversation? So you guys are going to have 20 minutes to do this, which is really quick. So it'll just be like 10 minutes per interview. So if you can set an alarm for 10 minutes right when you get into the breakout room, when that alarm goes off, you can switch roles. So at first time, like one person, like if I was doing this with you, Katie, like I would interview Katie at first, and she would answer all the questions. I would listen 90% of the time. She would talk 10% of the time. And then when the alarm goes off, we would switch and she would interview me. Same topic, but obviously different people and different careers. So I hope this is a nice chance for you to get to know each other. And then Ed, if you can pull everyone back at 6:50 from the breakout rooms, that would be great. Great. In our last few minutes, I just want to reflect on the experience of interviewing and ask you, everyone can take themselves off mute. If you're like, how did that feel being the interviewer? What did you like learn about it?
I think you have to be quite like adaptive and like frame your from their following questions based upon what the previous person had said, and not just like follow the script if like they're on a really good train of thought, like just ask a question in relation to what they were talking about instead of like quickly changing the subject to being like, okay, thanks for the pride moment, now for your challenge. Like it's like kind of dig into what they were saying.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let them feel like they're guiding the conversation. Make it happen organically. Like if they mention something in the first 1 minute that like comes at like 3/4 of the way through your interview guide, follow it still. Don't pause it. The goal is to get through your goals by the end of the interview, and it doesn't need to happen in your order. What else did you learn, or how did that feel?
I like that if you really focus on like a steady stream of questions, how much you really get out of that person, like how much more you learn just by continuing the thread of like questions instead of like trying to like give an example or, you know, kind of insert your knowledge. You're really just trying to draw everything out of them.
Yes, like everything they say should be so interesting to you. And you're just like hungry to learn the tidbits and the nuances and the details behind every bit of it. So yeah, I love how like if you ask one question, you go in deep into a story, you can really just be like blunt and say, okay, we're going to change topics now, or we're going to transition to a new question, or like, give me a second, let me just like look at my notes and figure out where we're going. You can talk aloud some of like the thoughts. You're like, what's my next question? Focus more on them and give yourself some breathing room in between questions if needed. That's great. Anyone else? How did it feel to interview?
An interesting thing is that how simple these questions were, but how much you're able to learn, like you just referenced. But more importantly, recognizing the overlaps or the parallels with the person that you were actually interviewing. There was so much commonality, and there are so many things that you could have identified with while
Yeah.
interviewing the person and listening as well.
That's great. It feels different in a lot of ways than like a conversation at like the water cooler, because you're really like being an active listener so intentionally that you go a little bit deeper. And yeah, I love how you said that it's just like simple questions, but they're so open-ended yet specific in some ways that you can get to some more interesting places than just like the high level, like, how you doing? Like, tell me like about your week. Yeah. Anyone have a good question that they liked, whether they asked it or someone asked it of them? I'll share. So I was interviewed with Chris, we were matched up, and I asked him, how has your approach to your career path changed over time? And his initial response was like, oh, like he didn't know. And so I think for a novice interviewer, you might be like, oh, don't worry. You start to like fill the blanks, like change the question. But instead, like it gave him time to think. And then he shared. And at the end of it, he's like, oh, I never really thought of that before. But he had made like these really neat connections and reflections on himself that were of great value. So like I said, I love asking how things have changed over time. How you
I had an awesome question from Katie, which was, if you had $6 million, like I'm just gonna write you a check for $6 million, like what would you do?
Yeah.
I thought that was super interesting. I've never been asked that, and it was kind of a way for me to reflect. Like, okay, if I had to build a business right now with $6 million, what would I do? I thought that was a good question. So
love it, like pushing it to extremes so people feel like completely unconstrained with their thinking. Great question. That's really good. Rather than like, what kind of business do you want to start? Like
yeah, I love the way she phrased the question. Like, okay, you have $6 million, right? Like, what are you gonna do? So I thought that was cool.
Cool. And how did it feel to be interviewed? How was that experience of like being the talker and having someone ask you questions?
You're asking the group, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyone can share.
I mean, I enjoy it. I get a lot of energy as an extrovert just talking with people. That includes listening as well. But I mean, I guess I'm like every other person, like talking about themselves, in the humblest way that I can say that. But I think that yeah, I quite enjoyed it, and like you had brought up in your question, it forces you to reflect in a time where I mean, people don't really take the time to reflect a lot, at least not in a deliberate sense. So being interviewed is developmental for yourself, even though you might just be sharing a piece of yourself. You are in many ways reflecting and digesting where you're at that moment.
That's great. You're right. We're all experts on ourselves. And concept of time or perception of time is vastly different for the interviewee than it is for the interviewer. So again, like silence is okay, giving them time to think, taking pauses to figure out your next question is totally natural for the interviewee. Great. Well, any questions for me on this before we sign off?
I just sent a chat a question. I was just curious. You have, Emilie, you have a very vibrant colored backdrop where you are. So when I'm interviewing someone, how important in a virtual interview, how important is the backdrop versus like, so some people may not appreciate their backdrop and they do some sort of like, we'll just say fantasy or something that is maybe blurred in the background. Can you talk about setting the mood for the interview? Is it important in addition to what you say? But like, if I'm in sales, so, you are supposed to just, create the environment you need in order to get the job done. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, pre-COVID, when I was doing at-home interviews, the goal is just to like blend in. Like, you don't want anyone to notice what you're wearing necessarily, for good or bad. Like, and so I think it's the same rule of thumb for remote. When I interview patients, like which I'm doing right now to test COVID vaccine messaging. I would say like I wouldn't wear these earrings. Like I'm pretty simplistic in my approach because like when I jump into their homes through Zoom, they're not pulled together for the most part. And so I want to like make them not feel self-conscious. I definitely don't have like a Zoom background on during them because they can be distracting. But I try to be as like real as possible and like not that polished when it's like patients or end users. I want them to open up and I don't want them to think that I'm like fancy or, you know, like high tech or modern or something. And this is for my patient population. So it could be different for what you want to project. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much, guys. If everyone could just type to everyone in the chat, like one thing you're looking forward to this week, we can go out with like, yay, we're gonna have fun this week or weekend. Yes, tomorrow's Friday. Woohoo. Oh, Zooming with your granddad. That's lovely. Movie night with my kids.
Oh, sledding.
Yeah, I know it's new. Great. Well, hit me up with questions. I'm always happy to like think through how you might get in touch with your customer. But my deck can be shared because I think the interview guide is pretty valuable over time if you tuck it away in some toolkit you have of your own. Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Emilie.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, thank you.